Okay, we're going to be reviewing moral relativism in this video. So, background. A proposition is just a claim or statement about the way the world is. Every proposition has one of two what are called truth values. Either true or false. Those are the two truth values. So falsity counts as a truth value. So does truth. Every proposition is either true or false, and there are two different ways for a proposition to have its truth value. One, a proposition can have its truth value objectively, or two, a proposition could have its truth value relatively. So, a proposition has its truth value objectively when its truth or falsity, whichever one it is independent of human belief and practice. So, for example, the proposition that the Earth revolves around the sun. That proposition is true. Furthermore, its truth does not depend in any way on anything about us, human beings. If I insist that the Earth, in fact, is the center of the universe, for example, it doesn't suddenly become true for me that the Earth is the center of the universe. Instead, it's just something I'm wrong about. I can be as convinced as I want. That proposition's truth value doesn't depend on my say-so. It is the case. Of course, it took us a long time to discover what its truth value was, sort of through human history, but a proposition's having a truth value objectively doesn't necessarily mean that we know it, or know it with certainty. Instead, it's about whether it's true or false, independently of us. A proposition has its truth value relatively when its truth or falsity is entirely dependent upon, and so varies according to, human belief or practice. This could be individual human belief, or cultural, or societal, or countrywide, or time relative, sort of historical era. Lots of different ways for the relativity to go. Simple example, the proposition that chocolate is better than vanilla. It's not as if that proposition is true or false sort of independently of anyone. Instead, the way we think about it, at least, is that chocolate being better than vanilla is entirely dependent on whose preferences you're talking about. So if somebody comes up to you and says, we've discovered that chocolate is better than vanilla, you're going to be like, oh, had you not tried either one before? And why are you saying we? In other words, when you encounter a relative proposition, its truth value is always had relative to a specific person's preferences or a culture's practices. Relative propositions don't have their truth value full stop, but only relative to human beings. Moral propositions are very general propositions about what is morally right, wrong, obligatory, forbidden, and so on. Generally, a good rule of thumb is look for language of should or should not, look for language of right or wrong, look for language of permissible. Of course, if the word moral is in there, that really tells you you're dealing with a moral proposition. There are, though, as a word of caution, shoulds and should nots, and ought and ought nots that are not clearly moral. Sometimes there are prudential shoulds. So if I say that if you want to pass this class, you should take the final, I'm not necessarily making a moral judgment, even though I've used the word should. I'm just saying, here's the most efficient way for you to achieve the goal, if you have it, of passing the class. So should and should not is kind of a good start. And then the second question is this a prudential should or a moral should? That is a hard question that we are not going to be able to get into. But if you know that for purposes of the test, that a moral proposition is a really general proposition, typically about what is morally right or wrong, what kind of practice is permissible or obligatory, that's good enough. We now, with those two definitions, we now can define the two categories of view at issue. One position is called moral objectivism. Moral objectivism says moral propositions are objectively true or false. So moral objectivism says if you've got a moral proposition like abortion is immoral, that proposition has its truth value independently of human belief and practice. So just as we can ask, is the earth round or flat? Full stop. So too we can ask, is abortion moral or immoral? Full stop. That's moral objectivism. Moral relativism says that moral propositions are true or false only relative to human belief and practice, or moral propositions are relatively true or false. In other words, according to moral relativism, moral propositions like abortion is immoral belong in the category of propositions like chocolate is tastier than vanilla, to be a little flippant about it. I mean, the moral relativist idea is that moral propositions are more like chocolate's tastier than vanilla for me, but maybe not for you, than it is like the earth is round, full stop. Cultural relativism is a specific form of moral relativism, and it's the kind of moral relativism that is both most popular, I think, and also the one that we focused on in class. I mentioned another kind of relativism that's on your handout. You should know it, but this is a review video, so we're covering a lot of the most important pieces, but not everything. The kind of moral relativism that we discussed in class, cultural relativism, or CR, says moral propositions are true or false relative to a given culture's moral beliefs and practices. Other kinds of relativism don't pick on a culture. They instead say, well, no, it's not that morality is true or false relative to culture. It's that moral propositions are true or false relative to, say, an individual's belief. Like, you think it's immoral, so it's immoral for you. I think it's moral, so it's moral for me. That's a kind of radical individual relativism. Cultural relativism isn't quite that radical. Instead, it says morality is relative to a culture. The main argument for cultural relativism, and one that you probably have encountered in some form in your studies or in everyday life, it is based on an observation of cultural differences, specifically cultural differences regarding moral practices. So the argument, which we'll call in a second the cultural differences argument, which begins with this premise that, hey, look at all of these different practices regarding morality from one culture to the next. That argument is most pronounced, I think, in the work of a lot of early sociologists, early anthropologists, early ethnographers, people who are encountering new cultures and new ways of living and being that were, for people coming from the United States or from Britain or Europe, very different. And I mean, this period of early exploration in the early social sciences had certainly its problems, I think, but one thing it did do was open the West's eyes to, oh, there are lots of other ways to do life. Our way of doing things is not the only way there is. And so I think there was a lot of people bringing back these reports were so moved by these differences that they were led to conclude that relativism about morality is true. So here's what William Sumner, an early sociologist, says. The right way is the way which the ancestors used and which has been handed down. The tradition is its own warrant. The notion of right is in the folk ways. It is not outside of them, of independent origin, and brought to test them. In the folk ways, whatever it is, is right. This is because they are traditional, and therefore contain in themselves the authority of the ancestral ghosts. Here what you see is Sumner giving us a kind of argument from the observation of differences, or differences in what he's calling folk ways and traditions. Look at all the different ways people do things, to the conclusion that there is no independent standard by which to judge, or in virtue of which some of these folk ways are better or worse than others. All there are different ways of doing things. That's it. It's not that some are right and some are wrong, or some are correct and some are incorrect. They're just differences, and they self-justify. Here is an attempt, and this is something like this you get in James Rachel's. I think improving the argument he gives a little bit, because he just gives a one premise argument and then points out that it's invalid. What I'm trying to do is just be a little more charitable and maybe reconstruct the cultural differences argument as at least a logically valid argument. And then what we'll see is that the second premise of the argument is really the one that's a little weak. So here's the argument. CD1 is the first premise. There are cultural differences regarding moral propositions. CD2. Every proposition about which there are cultural differences is true or false only relative to a specific culture. CD3. Therefore, cultural relativism is true. Or, therefore, moral propositions are true or false only relative to a specific culture. Here you see, first premise establishes, hey, cultural differences regarding morality. Second premise makes this really general claim. If you ever encounter cultural differences regarding any kind of proposition, then you can conclude for sure, I guess that proposition is a relative one. Therefore, moral propositions are relative. That's the structure of the argument. So just really briefly, why think that there are cultural differences regarding moral propositions? Well, there are tons of examples of different practices where one culture has one practice, a different culture has a different practice, and furthermore, they're both moralized practices. So they're practices that are believed by the culture to be the morally right way of doing things, a way that one is obligated to do, and that failing to do it that way is forbidden in the sense of violating a taboo or a deep norm of some sort. So the two that Rachel's mentions that we talked about in class, the Colossians versus the Greek burial practices. The Greeks burned the dead, the Colossians ate the dead. When they discovered about the other's way of treating their dead relatives, both were horrified at the practices of the other. Both thought, I can't believe that they do that to the dead bodies. That is wrong that they burn them and not eat them. Or that is wrong that they eat them and not burn them. There you've got a moral disagreement and a moral difference in practice. The case that we spent more time on was the Inuit infanticide case. This case is complex, and the empirical details, the ethnographic details are fraught. Different discussions with different members of the Inuit population yield slightly different explanations for why this practice existed. There's dispute amongst anthropologists about just how widespread it was. So I just want to flag all of that there is some contested stuff here, and I think Rachel's presents it. It's an interesting case, but I think he presents it as if some of that was not as complicated as it is. If you're interested, by the way, in this case, I've done some digging since teaching the Rachel's piece and thinking like, I wonder if it's more complicated. And I've found some interesting resources outside of the Rachel's piece that might be worth checking out. But anyway, the Inuit peoples, for some period of time, and some specific tribal groups of the Inuit peoples would practice a kind of selective infanticide of certain newly born infants. And this was not something that was kept hidden necessarily. So it was instead a kind of integrated part of their culture. Everyone knew that it happened and no one was going to be arrested for it. It was a thing people did, and when they did it, they didn't have to worry about the sanction of their community. In our society, if you commit infanticide and you're discovered, you go to prison. Because we think not only is it socially harmful, but I think most people think it is immoral in the same way that murder is. I mean, we think of it as a kind of murder, right? So there you have a clash of moral practices, so it seems, a moral difference regarding morality. Now, that's why we should accept the first premise. And we're going to actually revisit that defense of the first premise in a second. James Rachels thinks that both of these premises are weaker than they seem. He thinks that the second premise is just false. And then he's going to go on to argue that the first premise is shakier than it appears, is the way I'll put it. He doesn't quite say that it's false that there are cultural differences regarding moral propositions. There definitely are. But the way he puts it is that anthropologists and sociologists and relativists often overstate the depth and extent of disagreement across cultures about moral matters. Why does he think that the second premise is false? We didn't get a defense of that principle, and Rachels is right about this. This principle that says whenever you've got two cultures disagreeing over the truth of a proposition, that just means that the proposition is true or false only relative to a culture. Rachels is right that that is very rarely defended, especially in the texts that he's referencing, the early formulations of moral relativism and cultural relativism. But Rachels thinks it's not just that it doesn't have a good defense. So when we did Aquinas' First Way, for example, we discussed whether the third premise of that argument might not have a good defense. Rachel says it's not just that it's not well defended, but there are actually counterexamples to this principle. The counterexample is just a specific example or case that directly shows that a general principle is false. So the general principle is any proposition about which there are cultural differences, not just moral propositions, but any proposition where people disagree across cultures is a relative proposition. Here's Rachel's counterexample. You can read this if you want, pause it, but here's a little graphic. At one point, our own culture, I guess, at one point, believed that the earth is flat. There are still cultures in which there is a belief that the earth is flat. Our culture, though, through modern science, we've come to realize, no, it's round or spherical. So there you've got a cultural difference or disagreement. One culture says the earth is flat, the other says it's spherical. So the proposition the earth is spherical is one about which there are cultural differences. Rachels points out no one thinks that the shape of the earth is a relative matter. No one thinks that. That's crazy. Of course not. What this means is that here's a proposition about which there are cultural differences, and it's not relative. So our second premise there is false. It doesn't matter that it's not a moral proposition. It's a proposition where there's cultural differences, but it's not a relative proposition. It's an objective one. We talked in class about whether there are things that a sophisticated relativist could say in reply to this counterexample. You won't be tested on that, but I'm just going to flag that it's worth, if you're interested in relativism, it's worth continuing to think about, are there relevant differences between this geography example and the moral example? And if so, can you come up with a slightly more nuanced and plausible principle linking disagreement or difference across cultures to relativity? One that isn't susceptible to this kind of example. That would be really interesting if so, and the main project would be defend that principle, tell us why it's true. So the last the last thing to say here is that Rachel's also goes after the first premise. Effectively, James Rachel's is not only an objectivist, but he is also telling us why the main argument for cultural relativism fails or is unsound. And that argument, he thinks, its second premise is false, and its first premise vastly overstates the extent of cultural differences regarding morality. So his example that he uses is, let's reconsider the Inuit infanticide case. This seems like as stark of a difference in morality as you could possibly get. One group says infanticide is fine sometimes, the other group says it's always wrong. So how could that not just be a clear-cut difference? Rachel's idea is that there are really two different parts of a culture's moral system. You can think of it as like layers in a cake. The first layer, and this is the one we've looked at so far, is just a list of specific actions or behaviors that are permitted, prohibited, or required according to that culture. So, for example, this is what we'll call the moral code of the culture. The Inuit moral code says infanticide sometimes permissible. Our moral code says infanticide never permissible. That's the first layer. Rachel says that there's a deeper layer of a culture's moral system. That deeper layer isn't just a list of which things are prohibited and which things are permitted. The deeper layer says, what do we value? What is good? What is bad? These are general principles about what is intrinsically good, valuable, or desirable. We can call these the moral values of that culture. And what Rachel points out is that two cultures may have basically the same moral values. They might agree about what's good and worthy of preserving, even down to the last little detail, while still having differing moral codes. Not because there is some disagreement about, say, whether human life is valuable. There could be complete agreement on all the moral matters, but instead just because the two cultures, for example, face different physical circumstances. So differences in unique physical circumstances can lead to differences in a culture's moral code while sort of hiding a deep underlying agreement about moral values. And Rachel's point is that the story is simply more complicated than, well, we just disagree morally. It's like, yes, maybe at the level of moral code, there's a clash. But is that because we disagree about values, or is that because we find ourselves in different circumstances? He thinks that in the Inuit case, when we ask, why do the Inuit people do this? The answer is not because they don't value human life. In other words, the answer is not because they have different values than we do. And I uncovered some of this stuff, just researching it, that confirms, I think, what Rachel's is saying to some extent in some ethnographic reports of anthropologists, interviewing Inuit mothers and asking them, why do you have this practice? Tell me. And this particular anthropologist says it evidently was not simple callousness that led the mothers to do this sometimes, since children allowed to live were dearly loved and cared for. Instead, what the case material indicates is that survival reasons in an extremely harsh environment were behind this practice. So it turns out that the Inuit peoples were, many of them, nomadic, carrying everything they own on their backs. And often that fell to the women, who, in addition to carrying their belongings on their backs, had the children to care for. They're moving as a big group through very harsh, cold winters with harsh winds, low temperatures, and often insufficient food. So the men were often off hunting, and that's why they weren't there to carry the stuff. They're running low on food. they're running low on energy, they're trying to keep their little ones alive, and sometimes mothers would find themselves with another pregnancy, of course. These societies, they were not modernized societies. They didn't have access to birth control. When they found themselves pregnant with, say, a fourth or fifth child, there were cases in which they realized if this child is allowed to live and grow up, my family won't have enough resources to survive the winter. Either because we won't be able to move fast enough with me carrying everything and a fifth child, and we'll fall behind and freeze, or we won't have enough to eat, or some combination of the two. And so effectively what the mothers were forced to do was choose between, am I going to let this new one die, which is tragic, or am I going to almost certainly let all four of my others die and myself? And they made often the tragic choice of, I need to leave the littlest newborn out in the harsh environment where they'll die relatively quickly, and I think relatively painlessly as far as deaths go through freezing, so that the rest of my children can live. Horrible, horrible circumstance that's faced there. What I invited you to do in class, in order to get you in the headspace of James Rachels, who thinks, actually, although we never do anything like that, and we think anyone who would do it in our society is wrong, we could imagine ourselves in similarly demanding and difficult circumstances. And this is the lifeboat case. And if we were in those circumstances, many of you judged, I would sacrifice one person to save the rest. Many of you, your judgment didn't change when I asked, what if it was a member of your family? What if everyone on board was a member of your family? Many of you said, I guess I would have to kill one of them. Again, tragic, but what this illustrates is that the reason that we prohibit such a practice is that we don't face the lifeboat circumstance. The Inuit people have to integrate it into their moral system because those women were facing a lifeboat situation every few winters. So that's why at the level of moral values there can be deep agreement, but with the Inuit society facing the lifeboat dilemma and us never having to face it, we end up having differences in practice. So that is moral relativism. I hope that was helpful.